Hi, my name is Mike Sklash. I'm Senior Hydrogeologist at the Dragon Corporation. We are environmental consultants with offices in the United States and Canada. I'm hosting this series of webinars that provides you with 10 tools that will help solve your groundwater problems. My colleague, Jeff Bolin, is going to talk about interviews and site records in developing your robust conceptual site model. So without further ado, I'll turn you over to Jeff.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome to those participating in this webinar. I am Jeff Bolin, and I am the Senior Vice President of the Dragon Corporation. I've been working in the environmental industry for about 38 years now, and almost 29 of those have been with the Dragon Corporation. I was happy and enthusiastic when Dr. Sklash asked me to present on this topic. Having spent over 25 years of my career involved in real property transactions, I've been involved or conducted hundreds, maybe thousands of Phase 1 environmental site assessments. And Phase 1s are based in site records and interviews and are often the starting point of much larger projects that ultimately require the development of a conceptual site model. During the previous webinar, Dr. Sklash spoke about building the conceptual site model of your site and the importance of getting it right the first time. He spoke about how the CSM takes its shape and how the picture is refined using different tools. This webinar will review some of the basic building blocks of creating the initial CSM. It will focus on using existing site records and interviews to start your CSM. Too often during the peer reviews, we see that this step is overlooked and the effect that has on designing site characterization, ultimately on the CSM and remedial selection. During my presentation, I'll be presenting things kind of from a United States point of view relative to some specific records references. However, the overall approach applies to any CSM, and our Canadian office certainly uses the same approach, just with a different set of regulatory agencies and databases. Interviews and site records should be part of your initial step in building your CSM. It is asking the most basic questions of who, what, when, where, and how. Who has owned or operated the site and during what time periods? What are they doing at the site? Where were they doing it and how did they do it? All of these can begin to focus your understanding of the site history and help you design investigations and use of additional tools to develop a robust conceptual site model. Often we're given previously conducted reports about a site, or you may have even conducted a site inspection. While these are really important in the overall conceptual site model process, don't let these things cloud or influence your thinking about the site too much too early in the process. Think of your site as a blank slate and let your research of records and interviews start to draw the conceptual site model picture. Establishing answers to these basic questions as part of your CSM will be beneficial whether you are negotiating with a regulator, whether you're in litigation, or whether you're designing a remedial system. It may be that your research shows that you or your client is not even responsible for the release, or maybe only partly responsible. It may show that there are other chemicals that you should be looking for when you're defining nature and extent of contamination. It could be that there are other chemicals that could interfere with your remedial selection. A well-researched and developed conceptual site model can be used to show a regulator that you have looked in the right places and that there's no need to look any further. Many regulators ask for more simply because they can. And you need to have your ducks in a row when you say enough is enough. You've probably all seen these types of photographs in front lobbies or conference rooms of companies. You know, companies proud of their history and in their community, and they want to show it off. You know, this picture in our lobby is us in 19 whatever the date. But don't let these opportunities pass you by. Ask to get a copy or take a picture of that picture. There's actually quite a bit of information that could be gleaned from a photo like this. For example, just looking at this picture, it tells us that the facility has a very large footprint and that there's a lot more going on at this site than something as simple as warehousing. But what are some of the more obvious items that we can see out of this that might play into our conceptual site model? Right off the bat, the clarifiers for a wastewater treatment plant jump out of the picture. We will want to learn more about this as we dig deeper and may want to focus some investigation in this area. Additionally, it's apparent that the site borders a river. This triggers a number of questions. How does the river impact groundwater flow and the potential for migration of chemicals if they were released to the environment? Does the wastewater treatment plant discharge to the river? Is there a permit? Might there be residual impacts to sediment? Has there been flooding at the site? Additionally, the site appears to have its own powerhouse. What types of fuel were used? Were they coals? Were they heavy petroleums? Where were these fuels stored? How did they handle and dispose of residuals such as coal ash? Also, there's a railroad siding. And if looking at this picture, it looks like there was staining along the tracks. What chemicals and fuels did they receive in bulk quantities off railroad tankers? How was that offloaded, and where was it offloaded? Do they ship chemicals out by railroad? Same questions. Where did they offload those or unload it to tankers? All of these play into developing our conceptual site model, designing additional research of the site and subsurface investigation. Also, there's a large above ground storage tank. What was in it? How was it filled? How and where is it distributed amongst areas of the plant? As you can see, a lot can be gleaned and areas of interest can be identified from a simple photograph of the site. Taking it a step further, looking at sequential area photographs allows you to see the development of a property over time. And similar to the photograph that we just looked at, you can glean items that help develop your CSM. It used to be that you had to visit local municipal offices to review historical aerials or buy them from a utility company. Historical aerials are much more available now through online services, both for free and for a fee. For this particular site, we were able to get 11 aerial photos ranging from 1938 through 2005. And I've pulled a few of these so we can look at them and see how the site develops over time. This is a 1941 aerial of a site, which is outlined in yellow there. And this aerial does not necessarily show anything striking, but does show some structures on the site. And although not overly clear, it appears that there's residential property abutting the site. Approximately 8 years later, the site has been more developed with additional buildings. Also more defined in this aerial is that the site borders a river to the east of the site. How does that impact groundwater flow? The residential development of the property along the north and east also is more defined. So that prompts a question of, does the residential property play into the potential exposure and risk component of your conceptual site model? Jumping some 35 years to 1985, you can see significant expansion of the property and development of the site as well as the surrounding properties. And 20 years further along the site, along the site is significantly covered by buildings. Neighboring properties are also much more developed. So combining this information with other research allows you to prepare a timeline of development relative to the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how for the site and the surrounding properties. And I should make a point, do not omit those surrounding properties from your conceptual site model, as they may be a contributing factor to your goals. Did a surrounding site have a release? Has their activity somehow impacted or contributed to an area of concern? Do they pose maybe a third-party liability exposure potential from a chemical release on your site of interest? And this is a picture of the site depicted in the sequential aerial photos that we just looked at. And this particular photo was hanging in the hallway of the company's office. And as you can see, this type of an aerial photograph that the company specifically had taken of their property has much better resolution. So you add this into that evolution and you can clearly see that there are above ground storage tanks, a railroad siding, a roof stack, and all of these should be layered into your conceptual site model along with the previous information. And this layering of information, looking at the same site that we were just looking at in aerial photographs, we utilize fire insurance maps. Fire insurance maps are another great source of obtaining glimpses of the development of a property. There were a few providers of these, but Sanborn was probably the most popular. These maps were not available necessarily everywhere, but were prepared in populated cities around the U.S. They were used by insurance companies to help them determine the risk of fire within areas and help them set insurance rates. Accordingly, they provide information about company names, sometimes a brief summary of their operations. They show building construction and storage of chemicals, and especially flammable chemicals. Now, these can go back to the late 1800s, and they were updated on somewhat of a regular basis well into the late 1900s. So when they're available, they are a great supplement to the aerial photographs. By way of example, this is a 1967 Sanborn map for the same property that we just looked at in the sequential aerial photographs. And it shows that there were specifically some above ground storage tanks and some storage of oleum. We also utilize sequential historic topographic maps. These are sources that are updated over time and provide very useful information relative to developing your conceptual site model. It can provide information relative to the property development, surface water bodies, railroads, hospitals, schools. A number of key items can be brought from this. For the site that we've been following, we had a USGS map ranging from 1952 through 1991. And in this 1978 map, our site designated by the yellow arrow shows development consistent with our aerial photographs of that time period. Additionally, you can see the river and you can see some other development around our property that, again, could play into our conceptual site model. Another great source is regulatory files. It used to be that you had to search these files at the state and federal regulatory agencies. However, in today's world, there are companies out there that can provide computer database searches for a relatively nominal fee. Companies like EDR and Eris, just to mention a couple. And for the site that we've been discussing, the computer database shows that they had air and water discharge permits. They were a large quantity generator of hazardous waste. They had a release to the environment, that they were on their state hazardous waste site list, and that's still in progress. They had underground storage tanks, and they've had releases from underground storage tanks. Again, all of this information helps us ask the right questions as we develop our CSM. It tells us we should ask for reports that should have been prepared relative to these releases, and very possibly should be investigations of the subsurface that were prepared with these, and we should be looking for that information. So these types of things can really jumpstart the building and the development of our conceptual site model. And when it comes to trying to find out a variety of, I'll just call it technically things about your site, there's a lot of available information in the literature. You can have a pretty good idea of what you will be drilling into geologically before you ever put a hole in the ground, just by doing a little bit of homework. You can know by looking at a number of sources, you can know if you'll encounter groundwater, for example, or if you're likely to encounter groundwater. And a lot of this has been bought and paid for by our tax dollars. So certainly use it and use it to your advantage. Let's look at a couple of these. For example, the United States Army Corps of Engineers is involved in most of the navigable waterways of the United States. And this particular map, Harold Fisk maps prepared for the Corps of Engineers, is of the meandering Mississippi River. These meanders may be important if your site borders this river or is in one of these old meanders. It shows that it's a very complex subsurface that's occurring here. We had a site that bordered a river. The river had been rechanneled and actually concrete embankments were in place along our site. This changed how we looked at our conceptual site model with respect to how the groundwater and contamination at the site might flow, and how we ultimately approached our investigation of that site and the remediation of that site. Additionally, I mentioned previously that overlying your site onto geologic maps can give you a good kind of peek at the future relative to what you might encounter in the subsurface drilling. We had a site that was very well mapped in the literature and showed a sharp geologic glacial moraine boundary. On our site, we could pump groundwater all day, yet just 200 feet west of our property, people couldn't get groundwater at 200 feet below grade. And by looking at these maps before we drilled, we had a very good idea of what we would see in the subsurface when we drilled. We had a very good idea of where that boundary was or where we might encounter it. And further, as we moved farther along in the process, that hydrogeologic barrier was actually confirmed when we did some groundwater pump tests, which are additional tools used along the way. In addition to just geologic maps, you can get hydrogeologic maps from state agencies and federal agencies. And these hydrogeologic maps are great sources of information relative to the presence or absence of groundwater, the depth of groundwater, groundwater quality, whether there's brackish water, just a number of things you can tell even before you put a drill in the ground. These can be really helpful relative to what's happening regionally around your site and the potential for contaminant migration. Looking to historical societies, the history of a community is often chronicled somewhere. And if there is a historical society, they can be a wealth of information. They often have the old photographs of the community and possibly of your site. They document significant happenings in the community, for example, flooding and fires. As an example of how these can be helpful, these two photographs, the bigger one and the inset on the bottom right, show automotive dealerships. So if you see that as that's something that was on your site, did they do car repairs? Did they store fuel? And if you look at this a little closer, the larger photo shows that this was one in 1951, so that helps add to your timeline just by looking at the sign. It also shows fuel pumps. So these items, may help you develop your CSM, and they may be significant factors in how you investigate the site. So one thing beyond just looking at records is talking to people. Interviews are a great way to fill information gaps. It's typically pretty easy to understand the current condition and operations of a site through your site inspection and just interviewing of the current facility manager. The hard part sometimes, but is also some of the best sources of information, is when you can sit down with that guy that's been there a long time, that guy that's been there forever. This is the guy that likes to tell the stories that tend to start well before we had that waste storage area. He's the one that knows what they used to do with those waste products before they had regulation and they had to follow it. So you're trying to find those skeletons in the closet, and interviewing people that have been at the property a long time and have a history is a great way to do it. Another way is when you're interviewing municipal people. If you can find that, and I've got it quoted here, that old sanitarian that's been in that community for 30 years, they really know what has happened in that community, and can talk to the things about, well, when prior to your client owning that, when so-and-so owned it, they used to operate there. We used to get a lot of odor complaints. Just a number of things that come off a casual conversation with some of these folks can be really good information for your CSM. And although I've got this slide towards the end of this presentation, this is quite often where we start nowadays. We simply start by doing an internet search for the company name and the name of the regulatory. Many of the things that we've talked about throughout this webinar are accessible and can be found through the internet. We found information about lawsuits, mergers and acquisitions, and newspaper references to sites we've been working on, and it's really helped us build our site history. However, don't totally rely on it. Sometimes you can't beat a face-to-face meeting with the local community officials, so don't be afraid to step out from behind the desk and get a paper cut looking at files and talking to people. And as you can see, the sources of information here are plentiful. What we've talked about today really only scratches the surface of how much digging you can do. Clearly, you can never go through everything. Accordingly, you need to really think about your goal of your project. Is it litigation? Is it site closure? Is it a real estate deal? Regulatory negotiation. You need to think about that and select the searches and sources that you're going to look at wisely and efficiently. The key is do not, let me kind of repeat that, do not overlook the power of interviews and the paper chase in developing your CSM. As mentioned previously, if you were in Canada, you would be looking at various provincial sources and ministries for records versus the types of sources I have listed here that are more US focused. So kind of in summary, and to kind of wrap this up and how important some of this can be, the pictures here are of the Salina site that Dr. Sklash spoke about in webinar number 1. The information and records review was critical here. One thing, this is the old military base, one thing that the military is very good at is keeping very good records. And these were used to document areas of chemical storage and use and associated operations. And the photograph on the right is what the site currently looks like. The photograph on the left, which was obtained from military records, shows a suspected release running off release runoff, and it's kind of indicated there by the black arrow. And this was from plane cleaning activities in the late 1950s. We had a lot of difficulty based solely on soil and groundwater data identifying the source of a TCE plume at this site. This military photograph showed us what turned out to be TCE running over a paved area and to the edge of that pavement where it seeped into the adjacent soil. And the black arrow in the photograph on the right shows the approximate location of these activities shown in the historic photograph. We in turn used all of this to design our areas of investigation and into the development of our conceptual site model. So these in context, the paper chase really helped us pinpoint where that release started, and we combine that with our site data, and we're able to really define the source of a particular plume. So I appreciate and thank you for watching this. Hopefully this is helpful information for you. And furthering this, our next installment will be the geology and groundwater basics of helping understand groundwater contamination and developing your conceptual site model. Thank you again.